Madison, Wisconsin, there's a somewhat unusual church called the Madison Christian Community. And environmental efforts here started when Pastor Jeff Wild was hearing all the reports about climate change, thought, you know, we really should do something. Renewable energy is the way to go. The church needs a windmill. If we could generate wind power, that would be so cool. I think he was actually up on a mountain at Holy Wisdom Monastery on a windy day, which was what made him think of this. So, I don't know, your church may do the same thing. He called together a task force to do some research to find out whether they could have a wind turbine at the church. Well, the task force, the energy task force, what they discovered was to get a wind turbine big enough to generate the return on investment, where it pays for itself, you're talking about something that probably doesn't belong in a residential neighborhood. But they also discovered their south-facing roof was perfect for solar panels. And those were not liable to fall on the neighbors or be dangerous. So they got a grant to pay for the solar panels from a local organization that was trying to help nonprofits put in renewable energy. And they were deemed a perfect location not only because they had the south-facing window, but also because they were on a fairly busy road that runs just below this church, and so people would see those solar panels and say, hey, look, solar in Madison, who would have thought? So they were able to put those in, and actually, this year, they're going to triple the size of the array, and that will give them, I think, 5 to 6 times the amount, way more than 3 times the energy, because the solar panels have improved so much since these were put in back around 2000. They got their 3 bids, according to the regulations last year. They just have to actually have them installed now. They also discovered, this energy task force, that they could save a lot of energy just by changing some basic habits. Because one of the things they discovered is, if your energy use exceeds a certain level at once, you pay a higher price. Remember when we used to have the phone got more expensive during the day and less expensive at 9 o'clock? Turns out, I don't know if our energy companies do it because they won't give us enough information to find out. But in Madison, they've got rules like that. And also, if you exceed a certain amount, you pay a higher rate, which is supposed to get you to scale back, but they don't really provide you with enough information for that to really work as an incentive. But once you find out about it, you can do something. So what they discovered is, if you don't turn the dishwasher on until after you turn the sanctuary lights off, you pay a lower rate for your electricity. It's wonderful what you can do. And actually, that's reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because it means the power plant's not having to ramp up to a higher level and put out higher levels of emissions. They put the upper parking lot lights on timers so that only if that section of the church is in use do those lights go on, and they're not in use when not needed. Simple things like this. Changing the lights so they'd be more efficient. So they've been doing a lot of conservation, because if renewables are going to work, we also need to reduce the load, the amount of electricity that we need, so that we can make do with a lower amount of electricity, since it doesn't produce quite the same rate as our current systems. Now, Pastor Wild told me that it was really easy to get all of this environmental activity going in his church because they already had an environmental ethic. They just didn't really talk about it in terms of faith until he articulated it that way. One of the reasons for this is that this church is an unusual church in that it grew out of the ecumenical movement 50 years ago. It's the Christian community because it's 2 congregations. A United Church of Christ congregation and a Lutheran congregation share this building. They started this church together. But back when they were starting out as a storefront ecumenical church, they didn't have any money. And the reason that they were able to establish this church is that a farmer was selling his farmland for development, and he set aside 6 acres for a church to be in that new suburb that would grow up on his farmland. And the Madison Christian community received that gift of land. So they've always thought about their land as a gift from God that they have a responsibility to look after, to steward. And one of the ways they've done that is through prairie restoration. Now, this was very early in the spring, so it's not very notable. I have a better picture later somebody else took. I was just there really early. The building on the right is actually an addition they had to put on because the Lutheran community got big enough they needed a larger worship space. When they excavated the soil for that, instead of having it hauled away, they piled it in front. So you see this green berm in the front, and they planted that with native prairie plants. They actually went out to old graveyards and little pockets of undeveloped land along the roadsides of Madison and outside in Wisconsin. And they collected the native prairie seeds and brought them back and scattered them and created this native prairie. Now that might seem a little odd, but you have to remember, Madison, Wisconsin is Aldo Leopold's town. This is where he started all of that restoration. There are little pockets of prairie all over this town. It's practically the city pastime, is restoring little bits of prairie wherever you can. So they did prairie restoration, and then actually, if you want to talk about a project that forces you to have really good relationships with your neighbors, plant a prairie that you're then going to burn in the spring. They go around and they hang little door hangers on the neighbors' houses to let them know that when the burn date will be and to call them if they have any concerns. And members of the congregation have all been trained in how to do controlled burns, so they're out there with their water packs circling the area, making sure that nothing goes wrong. So they do this in the spring, and then it grows back, and you get these wonderful prairie flowers, and you get the insects and the birds, and it's just a glorious thing. Now, the UCC minister told me when she arrived there 10 years ago, she just thought that prairie was the ugliest thing she'd ever seen. But it's grown on her as she sits in her office and looks out the window and watches it go through its seasons. And last year, this was actually the focus of her blog, as she's writing about spiritual life and seeing all these metaphors for spiritual development in the prairie that gets burned back and purified and goes through its sort of death throes and then comes back stronger and without all the invasives and is able to move forward into this glorious state of spring and summer. So she was blogging about this all last year. So the prairie then, these natural areas and the activities that are going on in the church, they're integrated into the church projects. Well, okay, so we've got the restored prairie. There's also a tradition of doing a canoe trip on the boundary waters with the youth every year. That was started by the first Lutheran minister, and it's continued to this point. And so there's this environmental ethic, and that was really what Pastor Wild was able to tap into when he came and said, hey, we need renewable energy. It's now moved on to other projects where larger numbers of, the great thing about renewable energy is you pay for it once, it's up, it's there. The hard projects are the ones where we have to get people involved year after year after year and during the summer when no one's around. But they pulled that off too. So they have these wonderful gardens, the children's garden and the food pantry garden. And these are understood to be garden ministry, the purpose of which is to connect our community with God's creation. And they will do this, they say that the people will experience the grace of God in creation by growing and enjoying healthy food, learning about the interconnected web of life, practicing the care of the earth and learning about responsible land use, sharing the gift of the land and its bounty with those in need, and building relationships across boundaries of generation, class, ethnicity, and social status. So the food pantry garden, that's fairly self-explanatory. The food that they grow there gets donated. But the ministry they're most proud of is the children's garden. Because what happens in the children's garden is that they have formed a partnership with a community education center from a disadvantaged neighborhood 1.5 miles away. And children from that community come over on Tuesday and Thursday throughout the summer. They're divided into 2 groups. One group works in the garden, the other group works in the kitchen. And out in the garden, they plant the plants and they tend the plants, they weed and they water and they learn moral lessons. One little girl said, "You can't tell a lie with plants. I could tell you that I've watered, but the plant will tell you whether I really did or not." And in the kitchen, they're learning to prepare healthy snacks. Early in the year, of course, not from things grown in the garden, but later the food they've grown themselves. And up at the top, you see there a sort of peanut butter and banana roll-up. They didn't grow bananas, that was early in the year. But the children who prepare the food then get to serve the food to the kids who are working in the garden that day. And they are so proud to serve the food they've prepared themselves. And then they take a whole bag of food home with them every week. Now, one of the things they discovered is that for some of these children, that bag of food is a large portion of their family's food for the entire week. And there was one little boy, they discovered his family was pretty much living on the bag of produce that he brought home. So they were sending him home with 2 bags of food. It became a way to make sure that these children during the summer, when they don't receive the lunches at school, are getting enough to eat. There's another kid, he had a beautiful broccoli that he'd grown. And the next week they said, "So did you prepare the broccoli?" He said, "No, I'm saving it for a special occasion." Other projects they've developed that go along with these, they do rainwater collection off the roof. The minister wrote a grant and got the giant rain collector. They had this great, so the maintenance guy here, Tom Matthews, he was in the military and he did computer stuff there, and then he did sales and computer business. He's now retired and does the maintenance here, and he's one of these really cool guys like we have in Michigan who could just figure out how to do anything. He figured out how to turn a tractor into a veggie oil tractor. He figured out how to develop this rain collection system after he saw some guy do a demonstration on some fancy valve he developed for rain barrels. And then they got a bunch of people from the church together and they dug trenches and they ran pipes down to the garden and set up spigots so the garden can be watered with rainwater, which the gardeners tell me is just so much better than the city water. They also have a chicken house. This was an Eagle Scout project. Kids love chickens. Kids from the neighborhood insist when their families want to go for a walk in the evening, they have to go over to the church and check out the chickens. And if Pastor Wild is there, he'll come over and talk to them and let them in to play with the chickens. And he tells them, you know, you don't have to be a member of our church to sign up to help care for the chickens. We'd be happy to have you on our list. So these become sort of extra projects that have grown on the side as people take their talents and find ways to apply them to things that are going on at the church. And they add to the building of the community. So the mission of creation care has actually become part of the mission of this church. The mission is to live faithfully and lovingly with God, neighbors, and creation. And they're really motivated by this gift of land and this desire to care for the land in this particular place where they are so rooted. Pastor Wild says it has actually become a ministry of place. It's a theme in his preaching. And one of the things that's so beautiful about the way this works here is that it's integrated across the worship, the education, and the ministries. A couple of years ago, Pastor Wild received a bag of winter wheat. So he took the communion class out and they scattered the wheat during one of their classes. He wasn't sure it would work, but it sprouted, and it came up, and it grew. And as it was ripening, he started asking around, and he couldn't find anybody who knew how to harvest and process wheat. Well, that inspired him to preach a sermon on how modern technology has caused us to lose our traditional environmental knowledge, and how we're no longer as connected to the land and to our food as we used to be when we knew how to do these things for ourselves and did them by hand. That's when he found out that there was a Liberian woman in the congregation who did actually know how to process wheat because she was from a culture that still had these traditions. So they had a work day with people, young and old, gathered, about 30 people working together to harvest the wheat and to separate the wheat from the chaff. And then that same communion class that had planted the wheat ground the grain into flour. And various members of the congregation with cooking skills took the flour home and experimented. And then they baked bread that was used for the communion service to celebrate the 50th anniversary of their church. The gift of land, the gift of food, the children, the adults, everybody contributing. So you have this wonderful integration. So this is not a place where there's this core group of crazy environmentalists over here doing their thing on the side and there's everybody else doing church. This is a place where creation care is part of who they are and it pervades their congregation. Pastor Wild told me that they've become better Trinitarians because of these practices. He says, we always focus on Jesus and salvation, which is very important, but because of these activities, we also think a great deal about God the Creator and this beautiful creation and what we can learn about God from it. And we become much more aware of the Spirit moving in our community and in our relationships within our church and between our church and other people in our community. So it's affected the theology of their community. They've deepened their roots through those relationships, and also, when you go out and dig in the soil of a place, you feel kind of connected to it. When you eat from the place, you feel connected to it. And if you think about it, we now live in a culture where we don't pass our homes from generation to generation very often. We retire someplace to be near the kids who already moved away. So I think we're kind of rootless. And churches where people can have these multi-generational interactions become a place to have a sense of rootedness and belonging that maybe replaces some of the homestead rootedness that we no longer have in our culture. It's also very much a visible witness to their values. People drive down the road, they see those solar panels on the church roof, and they come and check out this church. They want to belong to a church that has solar panels on the roof. They see the gardens and they stop and check out this church. They want to belong to a church that does community gardening and provides local food. So these have become ways that they're really connecting with the needs that people have in the modern world and giving people a sense of efficacy and hope.